Okay, in this demonstration, we're going to talk about texturing objects. So far in this class, we've talked about modeling and we've talked about using the hypershade to add different materials onto objects. And for instance, if you want an object to be red or yellow or blue, we know how to change that color, but we don't yet know how to texture an object. So let's just imagine that you're making a wooden desk and you want to have a wood grain on your object, something like that. And so in order to add a texture like that, we need to go through the process of UVing the objects and then texturing it and then reapplying that onto the material here. And so I've made this graph, and so this is a visual guide just as a conceptual reference here. So this is just kind of to help you conceptualize what UVs are. So we have a model right here. So this is just a cube right here. And if we want to add a texture to it, we need to unwrap the UVs. And so the UVs are not exactly like the faces or the vertices or the edges, which is what we've been using to model an object. Is kind of a separate parameter right here. And the way to imagine UVs is to imagine that you're gift wrapping your object. And what we need to do is unwrap it and lay everything flat and then apply the texture to that flat surface and then wrap it back around the object right here. So you can see right here that, so the process is we have our cube and we're gonna kind of unwrap the UVs. Imagine this darker pink are the UVs here. We're gonna lay them flat like this. So get them entirely flat on the ground like this so that we can paint a texture like a wooden texture or something like that onto this flat surface. And then we're gonna import it back into Maya and kind of wrap it back around the object right there. So that's the idea, the broad concept of UVing right there. And for this demonstration, we're going to do a map right here. So we're just going to UV the simplest thing there is to UV, which is a flat 2D plane. And it gets more complicated from here, but I think this is a good place to start. So we're going to UV a map like this. And this map is, it can be found on the D2L, or you can go online and find whatever image you'd like to use on the internet here. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to yeah, we're going to UV just a flat object, apply the texture to it, and then bring it back into Maya here. The reason there's this checkerboard right here is the checkerboard will be key to the process here in terms of figuring out if we've got the UVs flat and we've got them even right here. So just kind of take a mental note that the checkerboard on your object will be a relevant thing here. Okay, so let's get started. So the image of this poster can be found on the D2L, but again, you can find your own image on, this is my project that I've been working in right here. And under source images right here, I've made this subfolder right here called map. And we can see that I have the image right there that I plan to UV. So let's get my open here. So the first thing that I want to do is, let me get this back to the general workspace, is I want to bring in that image, but only as a reference. And the reason that I'm only going to bring it in as a reference image is because I want to get the proportions correct when I'm building my plane, right? So I'm going to build a plane in a moment here, which will UV and then texture. But first, what I like to do is navigate out of my perspective view here. So I'm going to tap spacebar. And I'm going to go over to my top view right here. So you can press this 4-view mode button, or you can tap spacebar and look for the top view, tap spacebar. And we're going to import a orthographic reference image into the top view here so that we can kind of use it to trace. And so to import a reference image is the 5th from the left up here. So if you just click on this icon right here that I have circled, or my cursor is over right there. And we're going to go to, we're already under source images right here in my project. And I click in the map, and then I'm going to find the image that we're looking for. And oh, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Let's see here. Let's try that again. There it is. Okay. So I've imported the reference image right here. And if I were to render, this wouldn't show up in my render, right? When you're doing reference images like that, this is only so you can create objects to trace. And so you can see this is my image plane right here in my outliner. If you don't see your outliner, you can go to Windows and then outliner right here to find it. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tap W or press this button right here and just move this down a little bit just to move it out of the way. Notice that when I move this down, it doesn't change anything in that top view right there. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a 2D plane right there just by clicking on that button. You can see if I tap F right here that I created a plane. And I don't really need this many subdivisions in it because this is just going to be a flat object that we're creating. So I'm going to just, with this new plane object that I've created, I'm going to go to the attribute editor over to the right, look for the third tab that says polyplane 1, and then we have the subdivisions, and I'm just going to take that number down. And we could take this all the way down to 1 and 1 right there, but I'm just going to bring it down to 3 and 3 for a step that might be helpful for you all down the road right here. So keep it to a low number. I'm going to do 3 and 3, but you could hypothetically go down to 1 and 1 right there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my top view now that this is not taking up 10 by 10 faces right there. And remember, the reason I'm keeping these faces down is because each face that you have in your scene, your computer is having to render that face, is having to process it. So whenever you can find a way to keep the polygon count low, go ahead and do it, you know. And so we have a flat plane right here, so we don't really need a ton of faces here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press R for the scale button, or I can press this button right here. And I'm just going to scale this out. I'm going to use my reference image as a reference for my proportions right here. So that's all I'm using this reference image for, is as a guide here for how I should proportion my object right here. And remember, you can just tap 4 to go to wireframe mode. 5 is gray shaded mode, as I call it, and then 6 is a shaded mode where you can see the texture on your object, which we'll go over later. So you can either press 4 to bring this to wireframe so you can see your object underneath, or you can go to press, let's see, is it this button right here? The X-ray button right here, and it makes it so you can see through your plane right there. And so I'm not scaling this proportionally through the center square. I'm just doing the right scale tool and then the upper scale tool, and I'm just getting it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm just getting it to proportion with the image that we're going to be texturing onto this thing. So I have my plane right there, and as we see in the top view, it's proportioned correctly. And so now I don't need my reference image anymore. It served its purpose right here. So I can just select the reference image below it and press delete, and we are good to start here. So let me go ahead and save this in case something goes wrong here. So I'll just call this this. Okay. And so now it's time to start UVing this thing. And so to start UVing, we're in our general workspace right here. And notice that when you're in your general, or if you're in the modeling standard workspace, this tab right here, we have the modeling toolkit. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go click this workspace tab up here and then go down to UV editing right here. So we're in the UV editing workspace, and now we have the UV toolkit. And so these are all tools that are relevant to UVing right here. And we're only going to use one of these tools today, and then we're going to start adding tools to it as we start to UV more complicated objects right here. So you'll notice that if you go into the UV editing workspace, that this window should come up, which is the UV editor view, which kind of looks like the orthographic view at first right here. And we can see these are the UVs for our object right there. So if I click off of my object, this becomes empty. And if I click on my object in object mode over here, it shows up again. And so there's a few buttons up here that I want to show you all that are really important just to kind of get things started here. So first off, the first buttons that we should worry about right here is most of the time you're going to have this button engaged right here, which is the wireframe display. I tend to call it the gray mode right here, where we can just see our object over here in gray. And then if we click on this one right here, what this is like is it kind of shows what faces are inside out or not. And so ideally when you're UVing, you want to make sure to click this button every now and then and make sure everything is appearing blue. If they appear red, that means that the UVs are inside out. So let's just say if I clicked on my model right here, and I'm going to go back to gray mode. If I clicked on my model right here, and then I went to mesh display and then reverse so that the faces were black. Remember, that's the indication when we're modeling that the face is inside out. If I click on this button now, it's red. So when it shows up as red, it means your your models inside out. And if I were to apply a texture to this, it would kind of appear underneath it. It wouldn't really show up if we were to render it right now. So it's really important that these appear blue. And in the future, we'll show ways to fix that. You can go to mesh display in reverse for now, and this really shouldn't be a problem for this particular project that we're doing today. That's something that'll just come up later. So that's those two buttons right there. And I'm not going to go over all these buttons right now. I'm just going to go over the most important ones here. So this button's super important right here. So this is the grid display. If I click it, the grid goes away right there. If I click it again, it comes back on. And when we're UVing, the process that we're going to do is, we're unwrapping the object here. It's already a flat object, so most of the work's already been done for us in terms of the unwrapping the UVs, and you can see the UVs right here. And we're going to send it to Photoshop, texture it, and then bring it back into Maya to apply the UVs. And what we have to do is when we export our UVs, we need to align all of our UVs in this kind of flattened plane right here. And this 0, do you see these numbers down here? 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 grid. So we're gonna you're always gonna export a square out of Maya into Photoshop or whatever program you're gonna use to UV here. And when we UV, or when we apply the textures, you can use any photo editing program that you're comfortable with. In today's demo, I'm going to show Photoshop here. So you can go ahead and get Photoshop queued up, or whichever photo editing program you want to use. And so anyway, if these UVs right here, if the UVs appear outside of this 0 to 1 grid right here, they'll get cut off. So the texture will actually get cut off right there. And then if it's too small in this grid, that's less of a problem, but you'll lose some resolution when it comes time to texture here. So this button's really important right here. And then finally, this button over here, if you're on a PC, or if you're watching this video, months or even years after I record this initial video on a Mac, if you click this button, how do I say this? A checkerboard texture should appear on your object over here. Right now, it's not happening because I'm on a Mac and there's a problem with Maya right now where they haven't updated it to keep up with the OS. So if you're on a Mac, this might not show up for you. On a PC, it definitely should. And what the checkerboard texture does is it'll allow us to see if the UVs are in proportion to one another. So right now, if we look at this plane right here, and we look at the proportions of it, and we look at the way it's indicated here in the UVs, the proportions should be the same from over here to over here. So the checkerboard, when it's projected, will look stretched out over here right now. And so our job is to make it so the checkerboard shows up with black and white squares rather than black and white rectangles. So I'm going to show how to use this button. If you're on a PC, you can just click this button. If this button's not working for you, you're going to follow along with what I'm going to do here in a moment. And that's a workaround if this button's ever just not functioning for you right there. So one last thing I want to show right here between these two modes is right here in perspective mode, this is normal right here. So if I hold right click, I get the normal object, edge, face, and vertex options right there. And if I hold down right click and I do the pop-up menu, over here in the UV editor, if I hold down right click, it's a different menu right here. And you can see we can still select edges and faces right here. And you see if I select a face here, it selects that face over there. But there's also UV shell and then UVs right here. And so if I right click and then I go to UVs, I can select one UV at a time right here, or I can drag and select all the UVs at once right here. And that's what we're going to be using today. We also have right click and go to UV shell. If I just click on any area of the shell, is going to select the whole thing. And so the UV shell is going to make a little more sense when we do more complicated UVs, but essentially it just selects all the UVs that are connected to each other at the same time right here. So that just selects the whole block. And then if I right click and go to UVs, I can either select one UV at a time or select them all at the same time. So if this button's working for you, you can kind of ignore this next quick step that I'm going to do right here, where we get the checkerboard onto the object. If this button's not working for you, you should follow along with this. So in the hypershade, which is this button right here, I'm going to click on this little egg button, which is the hypershade. I'm going to create basically a basic material and then add a checkerboard texture onto it, which is super easy. So I'm just going to create the material I'm always using, which is Arnold. Go down to shader right here. So Arnold shader, and then go down and look for AI standard surface right here. So AI standard surface is the sphere with the A on the top right there. So I click on that, and we have, I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this or I'll call this UV right here. You could call it checkerboard, something like that. And all I need to do, see if I can get this window a little smaller. It's a little hard to select right there. So I have my material right there, but right now it's just a white plastic material, and I want to apply a checkerboard material to this. So under the property editor for this material, I'm just going to go down to this under base right here. It's the second option right here is color, and right now it's white, and it's got a slider next to it, and then all the way to the right there's a checkerboard button. And I'm going to click on the checkerboard button because I want to apply, that's what, whenever you want to apply a texture to something, you click that button right there. So I'm going to click on that button, and we're going to get this window right here. And in the future, when we're doing textures, we're going to attach a file to this, just like what we do with the sky dome. But for now, I'm just going to use this checker preset right here. And we have a checkerboard on this material right here. And that's really as complicated as we need to get it. And right here, I can just select my object that I created. I have my UV material right here. And I'm just going to right click on it, hold down right click, and go to assign material to selection. And you can see that it changed colors there a little bit. I'm going to close the hypershade. And so it's like, great, you know, we applied a checkerboard texture, but we can't see it unless we add lights and like render this whole thing. But don't worry. So remember, if you tap 4, that's the wireframe preview mode. If you tap 5, it's kind of the gray shaded mode. And then if you tap 6 on your keyboard, it shows the textures on whatever object that you have selected there. So if you press 6 on your keyboard, the checkerboard will show up. And so why did we go through all those steps of adding the checkerboard? The reason is we need to get the UVs flat and proportional. And so right now, if we look at this checkerboard, is indicating that the UVs are squashed right now. And you can tell because the UVs over here are, this is a square right here, and this is a rectangle over here, right? So we need to get this matching this. And when they're matching, this will become a proper checkerboard right here. And so to do that, it's a real simple step in this for this particular project. Is so we have our UV toolkit over here, and we're gonna use this in a moment here. But first, I want to hold down right click, go to UV right here, and then I'm going to drag and select all the UVs at the same time right there. And then in the UV toolkit, there's these different tabs, and we're going to go to the unfold tab, third from the bottom. And we have these 3 buttons right here. And these are the 3 buttons we're going to use in the future to unfold UVs. Optimize and unfold is basically a different algorithm that Maya is using to unfold and flatten out the UVs for you. And sometimes I'll try one. If it's not working, I'll try the other in future endeavors here. But for today, we're just going to unfold along the UV axis right here. And that's going to give us a better result for this project where we're just working with like a single flat surface right here. So if you click this button right here, unfold along, just click that, and notice that the UV's proportions changed right here, and we now have square checkers over here in our perspective view, which is great. So we're getting pretty close on this thing. So, but you can see, remember in the 0 to 1 to 0 to 1 grid, this thing, my UVs are now extending beyond that square right there. And that's a problem because if I were to texture this, my image would get cut off right there, and it would get cut off right there. So all I need to do is I'm going to do this again where I right click and hold UVs and select all the UVs. And instead of unfolding it, which is what we did last time, I'm going to press R on my keyboard or press the scale button right here. And be sure not to scale it this way or this way, because you see I'm stretching out my UVs again, right? We don't want to squash the UVs. We want them to be square right there. So I have the UVs proportional. So I want the proportions to stay the same. I'm just going to scale it in the middle right here. I'm going to scale it in. And I'm just going to scale it to a point where you can see that my UVs come most of the way in, but there's no part of my UVs that are crossing that line right there, you know? So just give yourself a few pixels of extra space right there and you're good. And you just remember, you don't want to make it too small like this, because this is kind of a good indication right here, is the resolution of the texture that we put onto it will be too low res if we scale this down too much. So you kind of want to find that balance where we're not cutting off the UVs, but they're not too small in there. So this is a good position to have them. And I'm just going to press File and Save. And we're now ready to export this out. Export out a UV snapshot into Photoshop, put that texture on, and then put it back onto the material here. So next step is we're going to export our UVs. So if you go in the UV editor, we have this top tab up here with these options up here. If you go to Image, and then down to the very bottom to UV Snapshot. So we're in the UV editor, go up to Image, and then UV Snapshot. And oh, before you do this, I almost forgot, make sure that you right click, go to object mode and select your object. So we need to make sure our object that we're planning to UV is selected in the object mode. So in your perspective view, right click, go to object mode, click on it so it shows up green, and then do this step where we go up to image and then down to UV snapshot here. And you'll get this window right here. And essentially, I think by default, it'll be like this, where it's the image format is a Maya IFF. And I recommend TIFF's usually good. You can do a PNG as well, but I don't really like using my IFF files for my image files. So I'm going to use a TIFF right here. And the size, we're going to go over this more and more later here, but Maya's always going to kick out a square composition. So it's 2048 by 2048. And I'm not going to get into the technicals of it, but you're always either going to want to work in 2048 by 2048, or if the image is going to be more in the background and you don't need as much resolution, you can work in 1024 by 1024. And if you're working on an object where the details really need to be in there, then you can either work in 4K or 8K. So 4K would be 4096 by 4096. And you really want to work in those exact numbers, because if I'm working in, let's say 1900 by 1900 right here, it's going to take up the same amount of computer resources as if I had done this by 2048 by 2048. And the reason for that is technical stuff that goes over my head, but it is the case right here. And let's see here. I think these settings might have gotten changed. So it should be 1 by 1 right there. You shouldn't have to change that right there. So essentially all I've changed is I made this a TIFF. 2048, which is the default, is good right here. For the edge color, this is going to be, we're going to export a UV snapshot out of Maya, and we're going to open it in Photoshop. And this is the color that the UVs are going to show up on when you open it up in Photoshop. And I kind of prefer my edge color to be black rather than white, but either one works. And then finally, last thing I'm going to change is this is going to just indicate where we're going to export it to. And so I'm going to press the browse button, and I'm in my 3D project right here. So this is my 3D project. Whenever you're exporting images out of Maya, it's always going to come out to your images folder. So your images folder is like your render folder. Source images is where you bring in images. So you bring in images here that we plan to use, and then we export images out of Maya here. And so I'm just going to go under UVs. I made a folder for myself called UVs under the image folder, and I'll just call this UV snapshot version 1 right here, and I'll press save. And this has not exported them yet. So this is a really important step that messes a lot of people up, is this will not export the UVs until you press this button right here. So press apply, and then down here in the bottom, you should see some text show up here indicating that it's exporting. So you see there's save file, and then it shows what the name of the file is and where it went. So it's in images. I have a subfolder that I created called UVs, UV snapshot TIFF right there. And so essentially what we're doing here with the snapshot is this is nothing more than a reference or a guide when we're using Photoshop. When Maya's exporting this UV snapshot, there's absolutely nothing fancy under the hood that's happening here with this file. It's just essentially telling us we're going to open this up in Photoshop. And when we put that map texture onto this, we're going to use this as a guide for where the map should go right here. And that's all it's doing. So I'm going to have, so under here, under images, this is the snapshot that we just exported right there. You can see that it looks pretty similar to what we had in Maya. And to open this in Photoshop, I'm not going to make this like a full Photoshop demo, but we can just click this and then you can just drag it onto your Photoshop icon right there. And it should open up for you right here. And I should indicate that I think a TIFF is kind of what I recommend for this. Earlier today, I did a PNG and these lines were just kind of thin and really hard to make out. And the TIFF, the resolution is just a little better. And it's easier for me to see where the UV snapshot is here. But you can see here, it's just one layer right here. I'm going to just double click it right there. I'm just going to call this UV guide right there. And then remember, these are black lines right here. So I'm going to press this plus button right here. So we have an empty layer right here. And I'm going to just use the paint bucket tool. And I'm just going to make it a white color that I'm going to paint bucket into this new layer that I created right here. So to do that, I'm just going to press this little switcheroo arrow button so that white's my main color. I have the paint bucket tool right here. This is the new layer I just created by pressing this plus button. And I'm going to just do the paint bucket tool. And so now I need to drag this so that it's underneath my UV guide right there. So I'm just clicking on it and then just dragging it down right there. And so now you can see that we have the UV guide that we exported out of Maya. Then I have the white image that I just created with the paint bucket tool. If I go up to, you don't need to do this, but if you go up to image and then image size in Photoshop, we can see that we have, if I move this to pixels, it's 2048 by 2048, which is the resolution you're going to generally want to use for most of your objects, except for if you have an object that's really going to be in the foreground, you might want to do the 4096 by 4096 here. And let's see here, I'll cancel that. And so now what I need to do is I need to bring in the map image that we're using. So I can just do the same thing is I'm going to drag Photoshop off to the edge a little bit here. And then I'm going to, in my Finder, go find the map, which is right here under my source images folder on my project. I'm just going to click it and just drag it till a plus sign shows up right here and let it go. And so now all I need to do is use the free transform tool to scale this up. And I think the default is already in the free transform mode, but once you want to accept the scale of it, you can press this check mark right here. But if you click the check mark by mistake and you want to scale this again, you just go up to edit and then free transform right there. You can press Command T or Control T if you're on a PC to get into free transform. But first, I want to take this image and just drag it so it's underneath our guide, so I can see the guide underneath it right there. And so I can just press Command and T, or go up to Edit and then Free Transform right here. And you do not need to hold Shift. So a lot of programs, you need to hold Shift to keep things proportional. But if you hold Shift in Photoshop, it makes it disproportional as you scale it. And we want this to stay in proportion, right? So we just click on this and then drag it up. Click on this and then drag it down so that this thing is, let me zoom in on it so we can see. So you can see here that this black line is the guide. I still need to scale this up a little bit to make sure that no blank area is showing underneath it right here. So I'm just going to scale it up a little more. You can scale it up just by grabbing any of these handles right here. And snapping, if snapping's turned on right here in Photoshop, it'll snap right to your guide, which is really helpful. So it just snaps right there. And generally speaking, I recommend, you can see this black line right here where my cursor is the UV snapshot. And you can see I have some handle, or what handle is another word for extra room right here where the image is going over. I'd rather have handle than areas like this where the image is too small for the snapshot right here. So I'll just press edit and undo right there. And this thing's now ready. And this little tool I'm using right here is called the Navigator. So you can either find it up here or go to Windows and Navigator, or you can press Z So if you tap Z, you can zoom in. If you press Z and then Option, you can zoom out in Photoshop right here. So whichever way you want to do right here. And let's see here. So this is pretty much good. There's one more step, and this is a step a lot of people forget right here, is the UV guide is still on top of my image right now. And it's a guide, that's all it is, the snapshot that we've been using. And so if I were to export this right now and I were to reapply this texture onto my object, these lines would show up on my object, which I never want right here. So I'm just gonna tap this eye right there, just because the UV guide has served its purpose. We're done with it, and I'm hiding it now. And now it's time to export this, and we can export this as a PSD, JPEG, or a PNG, and any of those will work fine here. And we're going to put it into our source images folder for Maya, because this thing's now ready to apply to the object. So in Photoshop, I'm going to save this, and I'm going to save this. We could either go to File Save As, and when you go to File Save As, you get some options to save it as a TIFF or a Photoshop, which are kind of larger layer files. So I'll just go ahead and under source images, map, and I'm going to call this, I'll do a Photoshop file right here. So I just, under here, it shows Photoshop, and I'll call this vid map version 1 right there. And it's a PSD, and I'll save that. So now we have a layered backup right here. But when I bring this into Maya, I'm actually going to use a JPEG because it's a smaller file type, and it'll just take up less CPU when it's time to render and stuff like that. So to save a JPEG, I just go to File, Save a Copy right here. So not File Save As, but Save a Copy. And now we have more options down here. And you can either save as a JPEG or you can save as a PNG. The difference between a JPEG and a PNG is they're both compressed files that are more CPU friendly, but they don't contain layers within them. So none of this layer information is going to come through. So that's why they're smaller. And a PNG will have the alpha channel contained within it, and a JPEG will not. So if you need areas of your image to have transparency to it, make it a PNG. And if you don't need that, then make it a JPEG right here. And so I'm just going to press save. And as a JPEG, a lot of times the slider will be down here. And in Photoshop, just always take the slider and move it all the way up to 12 maximum. The reason this is here is if you're trying to email an image to someone and you're using an email server doesn't have a lot of space on it, this helps you get your file sizes like super small. But we don't need that. We want the resolution right here. So be sure to have this at max, and then just press OK, and it's exported a JPEG here. So if we look under source images right here, where did I create it? It's this image right here that we just created. So now we're most of the way through. We just need to make a new material. We're going to bring it back to Maya, and we're going to create a new material, add this texture to the material, and then just apply that material to the poster, and we're going to be good. So in Maya right here, I have my image right here. And remember, before we went to the hypershade, because I needed to add a checkerboard texture to it. So I'm just going to go to the hypershade right here. And I'm going to make a new material and apply that poster texture right here. So I have this node view still open from the UV this checkerboard texture that I made before. There's two buttons I use a lot right here. It's this button right here, which clears graph, and then this button, which basically brings this graph back up. And the clear graph does not delete anything. It just gets it out of your way right here. So it's this little star button right here. So if I click it, that'll just kind of clear that out so this doesn't become too cluttered. If you ever need to kind of see those nodes again, you can just find whatever material you want to use and then press this double play button right here, and I'll bring it back. And if I want to get rid of it again, this button clears it out. So I am now going to apply the map shader or texture to this. So I'm going to make a new shader first. So I'm going to go down to same material I'm always using. So Arnold, shader, AI standard surface, the sphere with the A above it right there. We're going to make a new kind of white plastic looking material right here. You can see it's not named yet. So I'm just going to, over here, just name it poster 1 right there. And I haven't done really anything to it right here. And to texture this, we're just going to go to the second option, so color, And we're going to click on this checkerboard button right here. And so again, we have our poster material, which was the AI standard surface. You go directly over to the name it, and then go directly to the property editor. And we're going to the second option, which is color. It'll be like a little white box with a slider. And then to the right, there's a checkerboard button. We're going to click on the checkerboard button. This is going to come up. And we're going to use a file as the texture right here. So before, the main option is just a plain white, but we're clicking on this and we're going to do a texture that we just created instead of a white material. So clicking on that, and you can see it kind of constructs these nodes out here, but we don't even need to worry about those at all yet. And right here where it says image name, there's this little folder right here. So I'm just going to click on that folder. And by the way, if you ever lose track of this, let's say if we click off and we lose it right here, just click on this big, oh, sorry. So this is the material right here. This is the file that we're attaching to it. So if you ever lose track of it, you just click on this small node right here, and this brings us back to right to where we were right there. And so we just click on this folder right here, and we're going to find the image. And what did I call this? I called it vidmap1, and press open. And you can see that a material started to come onto there. And here on this object, this is a texture board. All I need to do is just select it, an object mode in my perspective view. Then right here where it says poster 1, I'm going to right click on it and then assign material to selection. And the map should show up for you right there. If it doesn't show up for you, make sure that you just have 6 pressed on your keyboard so that it shows shaded textures to it. If that still doesn't work, I would recommend just very quickly just making a blank skydome light. So go to Arnold lights and then skydome light and create just a plain white light shining in every direction so that we can see what this is like lit. And then just go to Arnold render. And there it is. So we now have a plane or a poster that is UV'd and a texture is applied to it right here. And just, I'm going to show this process one more time before we clear this out. So I'm just going to delete this poster material just in case anyone missed any of these steps and want to see that clarified. So you can see when I deleted the material, this object turns green, which is my indicator that there was a shader connected to it or a material connected to it, and that material is gone. So just to show that one more time is, so I go to Arnold shader, go to AI standard surface right here. It creates this plain white plastic material. I'm going to name it right here. I'll call this poster 2 this time. Oops, what did I do there? Let me press Command Z. My hand slipped and I hit a funny button there. Okay, so I'm going to call this poster 2. And then we go to color. We're looking for this checkerboard button right there. This view will show up. You click on file because we're going to attach a file. Then we go back over here and click on this folder button right here because we're going to go into our directories and find the image we want to use and map. And I'm just locating my image right there. And then to apply it to our material or to our objects is I'm going to select my object right here. I'm going to right click right here and then assign material to selection. And we have our material right there.